In this lesson, we're going to explore the content methods. Now, there's a lot going on in here, so let me start with just the basics and use a 2D container to explain these. All right, this time I'm going to use my shelf buttons to actually generate these. I'll choose my 2D container first. Okay, and what I'm going to be doing as I work is I'm just going to close up all of these pullouts here or foldouts, and that way we can focus on a certain area. Okay, and that way we can close things up and remove some of the clutter and confusion that could be brought up. Now, all of these containers have these sets. Okay, so density is essentially what you saw earlier, which was that the particles that you saw, the white fluid system that you saw, that is density. That's what we're previewing. Okay, now you can do three things with this. You can set it to static. Okay, if you set it to static, that means there is an even system throughout it, or you can go in there and paint certain areas. So I can paint density over here and then let it go. Okay, I can set it to dynamic, and what dynamic means is we're going to be using something like an emitter or the paint tool or something that's going to put some of this density into the container and then let the simulation figure it out, let it move it around. Okay, and I'll actually show you what these numbers are looking like for the actual density happening inside of all these voxels. The other option is a gradient. Now let me go ahead and shade this so you can see what happens. A gradient is a way for Maya to just put in some data. Right now it's constant, which essentially is fill up the whole container. But I could say, you know what, give me an X gradient, or give me a Z gradient. Give me maybe a negative Y gradient, okay? So we can come in and create any type of basic gradient from any of the XYZ directions. We can also choose a center gradient. And you can see here it's got a kind of a rounded gradient for us. And we can control how wide that is here in a little bit. So why would we need these? Well, for some of these things, let's say, for example, I'm going to leave my density to dynamic grid. My velocity is going to be dynamic grid. That way we actually see an animation. Let's go ahead and add an emitter and actually get some particles going in here so we can actually see what's going on. I'm going to just move this down a little bit, and let's just preview this. All right, there it goes. Now, if I was to take my velocity and set this to off, nothing. My particles don't move. There's no velocity being calculated inside of my system. My particles are just born. Okay. If I set this to a gradient, and let's say we use a negative Y gradient, watch the behavior. That's totally different than what we had earlier. Okay. Again, if I set this to positive Y, there we go. Let's choose negative X. Okay, and then I'll just set this back to dynamic to show you the default. There we go. So why are we seeing that? Well, again, if I was to set my gradient to my density and then choose, let's say, negative Y, you can see that up here I'm going to have a higher level of velocity than I have down here. So those particles are coming up and then just grabbing a hold. Okay. So again, it's one of these things that the more we practice, and we're going to build lots of different things, the more we practice, the more you're going to get comfortable with this system. Okay. Essentially, all these fluid systems essentially boil down to this little bucket of items: density, velocity. Okay. Velocity is the movement. Temperature is the heat that is being generated inside of the system, and fuel is the essentially the ignition. So if you have density and you increase the temperature, you will create essentially like a spark, and to feed the spark you have fuel. Now a lot of this, again, as we start playing with the different attributes and hooking them up, this will make a little bit more sense. But again, just to remind you, all of these attributes have the exact same setup. Okay. You don't have a fuel static grid because essentially the fuel needs to be calculated. Okay. Now, the color method, very, very interesting. Right now, we're using a shading color, but we can go in and say, you know what, I want you to use a dynamic grid. And by using a dynamic grid, I want you to calculate what happens when one color mixes with another color. So let's set that up real quick. Okay. We'll again select this color. We'll choose emit color, and I'm going to pick a bright yellow. So let's just test this. All right, great. Now I'm going to go ahead and select the container, go down to Fluid Effects, Edit, Add Edit. We're going to choose Emit. And now this one, I'm going to move off to the side, and I'm going to change its color to a bright red. And we'll choose Emit Fluid Color. All right. So as you can see, by us setting the color method to dynamic grid, we actually get orange now wherever we're mixing this in. However, if I change this back to use shading color, what I get is essentially we have a shading color of white, so both my emitters are white. Okay? So if you want two colors to interact, you need to set that to dynamic grid, and off they go. Okay? We're going to come back and talk about fall-off method when we actually get into painting some of the options. What we can actually do by using a fall-off method set to a static grid, we can actually paint an area inside of this container and essentially say only paint particles or only render particles in that painted area. So I'll show you how to do that when we get into painting actual objects inside of, or actual properties of the container. All right. So a quick look, I know that's really fast look at content methods. We're going to be using this throughout the rest of the training. So you're going to get a lot of practice of setting these individually. What's really, really nice about this system is if you're trying to do something and let's say temperature needs to be set to dynamic, the system will actually tell you, hey, you know what? We're going to need to set this to dynamic if you want to use it. You want me to set it? Yep. And then off it goes. It'll take care of everything for you.